Okay, let's quickly go to another viewer. Thanks for calling.
Yes, this is just an observation. It's not a question. I realize the grief of the moment is overwhelming in a situation like this, but I feel a large percentage of the population in America would still give almost anything to go on a trip such as the shuttle and be on the leading edge of technology and discovery. I feel it would be a shame to see this program shut down because of a setback, and I hope that that will not come to be in the future. That's really all I had.
Bernie, I'd like to add a comment to that, too.
Yes, I was going to ask you, is there really any possibility that this program would be shut down?
Oh, I don't think there's really a possibility of that, but I would like to give a more personal reaction to the caller's view. I've applied to be one of the first journalists in space. Now, I don't know whether or not that program will continue in view of what happened today, but I am fully prepared, as soon as we find out what happened to this vehicle, to take my place on that flight if they would have me. And I think this reaction is typical of many of us in this country, and I fully agree with the man who called in from Kansas.
Could I add to that?
Yes, please.
I'd also like to amplify that point of view. I think many of us have wished that we could fly. I would still jump at the chance to fly on a shuttle mission, even if it was the next one to go next week, regardless of what happened today. And I think that those people that lost their lives today fully realized that they were in a risk situation, and I think they knew what it was that they had on the line.
Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. We'll continue our quest in space. That's what President Reagan said from the Oval Office at 5 o'clock, roughly 5 o'clock Eastern Time this afternoon in his public response to what has happened. Area code 202-898-7600. We want to thank our guest in New York, Jerry Gray, who's with the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. He's going to have to leave us very shortly. We have time for another phone call in this segment. Let's go to the telephone and see whether we can hear from another viewer. Let's go here. You're on the air.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I was wondering where the pad hasn't been used in almost 10 years or over 10 years. I was wondering if that had any possibility of damaging the craft when it took off or anything like that.
Jerry, any thoughts on that, or has he already left?
No, I'm still here.
Okay, thank you.
I don't think it's likely. If something had happened right at launch, that could be certainly a possibility. The fact that the flight was already 1 minute past, and that's well down range, means the chances of some damage that would not have shown up earlier are slim. It is a possibility, but I would think it's one of the slimmest of the ones that have been proposed.
As you sit out in the audience watching CNN, wherever you are, here in the United States or elsewhere around the world, certainly the callers from our viewers have varied very greatly, depending on one's knowledge and background. And perhaps some of the men and women in NASA are appalled or delighted with the quality of some of the questions. But today's tragedy has all of us thinking. And when we come back, we'll hear from a psychiatry professor from the University of Chicago who deals in child psychiatry. And we're going to hear from him and hear from you, because as President Reagan indicated, and as we know, because of one of the crew members on the Challenger shuttle, there was intense interest by the nation's young people in what was to have been Challenger's mission. We'll return with our continued coverage and our extensive coverage of what happened today in just a moment. A very reflective day. We appreciate your phone calls tonight on this extended coverage of what's happened. Our guest now is Dr. Bennett Leventhal. He's the Director of Child Psychiatry at the University of Chicago. In that 5-minute address that President Reagan made from the Oval Office today, at one point we, in our live coverage, I can recall saying that the President was fulfilling his role as Commander-in-Chief and also as the leader of the United States of America, grieving with all of us and certainly with the families and the survivors of these 7 Americans, but also seeking to inspire the young people, Christa McAuliffe, aboard that spacecraft. Psychologically, to the millions of young people who are so involved in this mission today, how do you counsel them?
Well, I think there are a number of issues that are very important, and the first and foremost is that this was something with which young people could identify. An astronaut or a president or a congressman is someone who's vague and distant. A teacher is a very real person to most young people. They have teachers, and they're people with whom they readily identify. And I think we all, but particularly the young people, readily identified with Miss McAuliffe. And to see her and to see what has happened to her as she's gone through the experience of training, but also preparing us and preparing our children to learn from her in space, I think involved them a great deal, much differently than many of the other space programs. And for them, this was a particularly critical time and very disappointing. And I think one of the best things we can do for them is to tell them that we share their disappointment and to listen to them and to understand from them in their own words, in their own thoughts, what the disappointment means to them. And when we do that, then we'll be able to learn how best to help them get through the time.
Dr. Leventhal, it's difficult to think back to age 8, 9, 10, and up to especially the ages of the people at Concord High School where she taught in Concord. But for a young person, for a young mind, is this too much reality too soon?
I don't think young people are afraid of reality or unable to comprehend it. I think what they need from us as adults is the kind of guidance and direction so that they can handle reality and they can incorporate it into their life's experience. So it becomes, in part, our responsibility as adults, and most particularly their parents and their teachers, to help them incorporate this experience and to say that, although it is a terrible tragedy, there are things that they can learn from it as well.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave, the president said at one point in addressing his remarks specifically to young people. What was he trying to do there with that phrase?
Well, I think he's trying to tell young people, as we all would like to tell them, that there's a certain risk in doing something new and different and reaching out to a new frontier, and that risk sometimes leads to injury or even death, but that doesn't mean we should stop. That in youth and in our new knowledge, we can find hope for not making the same mistakes and moving ahead. And I think young people are willing and able to hear that message from their elders.
I'm thinking now about Mrs. McAuliffe's husband, who's still in Florida, their little son, young son, and their daughter. How do you get your kids to, of course, remember a mother who was so important to them and to remember what she was striving to do and have them walk away from this with a positive attitude?
Well, you only have one mother, and when you lose that mother, no matter what the circumstances, be it circumstances such as today or any others, it's a terrible tragedy and will have a lasting impact on these children. And I think it will only be a positive experience for them in whatever way it can be positive if their father and the friends around them can continue to tell them about what their mother was that was good and let them express their very strong feelings, both sadness and anger and disappointment, to people that are willing to listen. This isn't a time to say, be tough and don't cry. It's a time to say whatever you feel is okay. And I might add that that's true for all the young people who are older people who have experienced this terrible tragedy today.
I'm thinking about also the children of the other astronauts aboard the Challenger.
It's a terrible experience for them, and I think that it's one that we know from our studies about grieving that it will take months, if not years, for them to fully understand and fully recover from the impact of today.
Area code 202-898-7600. When we return, we'll hear from you on the telephone. Our guest is Dr. Bennett Leventhal, Director of Child Psychiatry at the University of Chicago, and we're going to go to your telephone calls. You're on the air.
Hi, I have 3 young children that we're about to take our first plane ride with next week, and they've been very apprehensive to start with. How do I get them over this crisis?
Well,
what they saw today.
Since I don't know your children, it's difficult to be very specific, but I think whenever a child faces a new experience, and particularly one about which they might be apprehensive, there are 2 things that are very critical. One is their parents' responses, and I think if you can make yourself as comfortable as you can with the experience, that in and of itself will help your children. But secondly is to ask them what they're worried about, and you will hear from them certain perceptions or fears, some of which are quite realistic and some of which are not. And if you can separate for them the reality from misperceptions, you'll do them a great service and help them deal with the situation appropriately. And finally, is not to dismiss the fact that there's a certain risk in going on an airplane, as there is in crossing the street, as there is in doing many other things, and that being a little bit fearful isn't always a bad thing.
If your child says to you, I don't want to die, I'm afraid of dying, I'm too young to die, how do you counsel that child?
Well, I think if they say they're afraid to die, then you ask them what they're afraid of, and try to help them articulate it. If they say they don't want to die, that they're too young to die, if they're very young children, I think it's important as parents to tell the child that you can do that they're right, they are too young to die, and you're going to do everything in your power to protect them from death and illness or anything else that can do them harm. And that's a very comforting piece of information for them to hear again and again.
Let's go to another caller. You're on the air.
Thank you. I just
You're
wanted
welcome.
to ask if the doctor feels like maybe it was mishandled in Concord in that high school. They shouldn't have shoved those kids out the door. Wouldn't it have been better to keep them inside the auditorium where they could know what was going on?
Well, since I wasn't there, I really can't comment directly on what they did. It's my understanding that they didn't shove them out the door, but rather returned them to their classrooms where, in small groups, they could talk to their own teachers about what had happened in the experience. And then later they returned to the auditorium to share it as a group and to get updated on the information. If that's what they did, it seems perfectly reasonable. Again, I think it's hard to generalize for all people, and one has to trust that the people that were responsible for those children, the principals and teachers, were handling it in the best way they could at the time.
I had the feeling, as we saw the principal speaking, that this indeed, the faculty members down to the janitor, as well as the student body, they were watching this on live television, many of them, that this was actually a tragedy within a very special family.
Oh, I think there's no question about it, and we all know that within our own communities, but this is one which came at a time of great hope, expectation, and went from a high degree of enormous joy and happiness to the pits of despair, and such a dramatic change is very difficult to comprehend and very difficult for anybody to handle, even for those of us who are somewhat removed and just watched it on television, even sometime later.
Let's hear from our next caller. Thanks for calling.
Yes, I was wondering if the children of the astronauts today were given counseling immediately by NASA, or if they have to return to their own hometowns to get counseling. The families seemed to be ushered off right away, and they disappeared. And there were children crying, some were laughing because they weren't aware of what was going on. And I was just wondering if NASA was trying to handle the families, or if they were just left on their own.
Well, I can't tell you specifically what NASA did or what arrangements they made. I am familiar with some of the programs that the military has for providing immediate counseling service for families whose spouses or parents have been lost in action. And I would presume that they would avail themselves of these services.
And for those who were down at the VIP section at the Cape watching the launch of the Challenger, they actually immediately got them and took them out of the stands and took them away. And as part of this effort, President Reagan asked Vice President Bush to fly down there, as he did with Senators Glenn of Ohio and Garn of Utah. We understand that they're en route back to Washington. 202-898-7600. Do we have time to go to one more phone call? Real quick, let's go to line 2. You're on the air.
Hello, I'm calling from Austin.
Yes, please go ahead.
My call is more in relation to the gentlemen that were on the show earlier, not to the child psychologist. I just wanted to ask those people what they felt that there was a lot of talk about cost and how all this is being funded.
Well, unfortunately, those other 3 guests have departed, but we thank you for calling. We also thank you, Dr. Leventhal, for coming in. When President Reagan addressed the nation earlier today, the president concluded his statement with a quotation saying, in part, the Challenger, the crew, slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Those words were written by John Gillespie McGee, Jr. He was a 19-year-old American volunteer with the Royal Canadian Air Force. McGee was killed in training on December 11th, 1941. If we look to the heavens, as all of them did, the people aboard the Challenger. We can see hope, we can feel comfort in our anguish, and we can know resolve. I'm Bernard Shaw. Larry King was off tonight. The CNN Evening News is next with Don Farmer and Chris Curl.